Revelation, that is the last book of the New Testament that we're going to be covering. This is going to be a longer study than normal. We will not be getting through it the first night. I will also have additional handouts for you as we go through this study. There's a lot in here, a lot of good information, and to help us to have a better understanding, I'll be giving some other additional handouts that'll go along with what we have right now. The handout that I've given you should not expand beyond this other than the additional material I give you. So this is the primary material that we will be covering as we get into the Revelation. All right, so typically when we look at a book, we've been considering New Testament books, doing a study through each book. And we begin typically with the author. That's not where we're going to begin tonight. Tonight, what I want to start with is a premise of interpretation. When you look at the Revelation, it's important that we have an understanding of proper interpretation. Revelation is one of those books that people tend to avoid because it is highly symbolic. And so they tend to stay away from it because, well, I just can't understand it. And some people are afraid of what they might find there. And so they stay away from it. And if we understand some principles of interpretation, then it'll make it easier for us to study the book itself. Now, one other thing is trying to understand the symbols. And I'm going to show you several different ways that people interpret this epistle, or this, it's not really considered an epistle, it's the apocalyptic literature, and how they interpret it. And it just shows that over the years, different groups of people have tried to interpret and understand, and they come up with different views of it, right? So we're going to do our best, and I'll explain each way it's interpreted, and then do our best to understand which one of those ways is the best way to view it in line with what the writer is intending to get across. So, to begin with, one look at just some basic information on interpretation. So, interpreting the book of Revelation, several things must be kept in mind. First, Revelation is full of references and allusions to the Old Testament, especially to the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah. We cannot read the book apart from its Old Testament background. So it's important that we include an understanding of those books into the Revelation itself. In fact, one of the things that plays into these Old Testament references is the author himself being very familiar with those books he's including in here. So he's not someone who didn't know about these books or understand these books. Secondly, it is a book of visions. As with the parables of Jesus, we must be careful not to miss the main point of John's vision by trying to explain every last detail. Sometimes what happens when people are trying to interpret passages is they get caught out in the weeds. They begin to argue about the minutest of points, and they're missing the overall message that's being said there. And you don't want to get caught up in trying to explain every little thing. Sometimes, for example, in parables, we know that not everything in the parable has a spiritual meaning to it. It's just part of the parable, and there are parts in there that have the spiritual meaning, but not every facet of it. For example, if you look at the pearl of great price, we call it the pearl of great price, all right? So the kind of dirt it was found in doesn't matter. Oh, what kind of dirt was it found in? It doesn't matter, right? So there's a pearl. It's talking about the kingdom. What's the overall reference to it? And why did the guy do that? You know, did he have any right to go and sell everything he had and buy that and not tell the landowner that he was buying this land with a great pearl in it? Isn't he ripping somebody off? I'm like, okay. You're just going off into the weeds with stuff, and you're missing the point. So with Revelation, we're dealing with visions, and so it's not important for us to try to figure out every little thing about the vision as if every aspect of it has some important message to us. It may not. Bible prophecy in the Western mind has a disconnecting way of telescoping events so that one prophecy can apply to several instances that are separate in time. It is also true that many of the prophecies that have already been fulfilled, for example, prophecies concerning, Christ, are clear in retrospect, but were not clear ahead of time. Not even the prophets themselves. You go back to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10, that they longed to look into these things, right? That they didn't fully understand what they were prophesying about. This should make us cautious. So in other words, when you're approaching the text, don't be eager to jump with the text to some far-fetched conclusion of what that text means. There are things that have been revealed, and there are things that would, for them, yet to be revealed. And so, that being the case, we don't want to get carried away with it. And if you've ever done a study of the Revelation before, you'll know what this is talking about when you begin to get into interpretations of it. And I mean, look, you can see it today. Somebody sent me something the other day. They're like, "Did you know that we're in the end times?" I'm like, "Since the first century." Yeah, the end times began in the first century. No, what's going on with Joe Biden? He's the Antichrist, and here's all these things they're doing. I'm like, prophecies are being fulfilled before our very eyes, and the Revelation tells us this. And I can find you 100 different people writing 100 different contradictory stories about what's going on in the world today. And it's going beyond and trying to create something and making what's happening today fit into, this must fit because look. Go ahead, son.
Well, they've elected a lot of Antichrists in office, if that's what you want to put it on it, because there's been a lot of people that have elected up there that have no moral standing.
Yeah, I mean, really.
Yeah.
Like, he's the first one. Okay. No. So keep that in mind that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And I remember studying, my parents were members of this particular church right when we became Christians, and they sent us this material to study, and it was on the Revelation, and which is really a great material for you to study as a babe in Christ. Let's study the Revelation. You're a babe in Christ. You don't even know what the book of Daniel is. And so I get this, and look, I didn't know anything about it, but just from reading what they were saying, I just kept thinking, this is about the silliest thing I've ever heard. They had helicopters and nuclear missiles, and I'm like, where are you guys getting all this stuff from? Oh man, it's coming, all these things in the Revelation, it says. I'm like, really? That's, because I go, so what were the people back in the 1700s calling it? Cannonballs and I don't know what, It's like through every age, if somebody would have interpreted that, they would have had to apply to what was at their point in time. Let's say we go another 2,000 years down the road from here, and all those things are gone. What are they going to see it as? You got to be careful because you're trying to interpret it within your time frame. And that's what he says right here, the Western mind, right? So we try to fit it into this and say, this has to be that. And very cautious about that.
It doesn't teach anything that is consistent with the rest of the Bible.
Yeah.
It doesn't teach anything that the rest of the Bible.
It's not going to be inconsistent with it. Right. So here are the main interpretations of Revelation. All right. There are many interpretations of the book of Revelation. The four most common are usually called the preterist, historical, futurist, and idealist interpretations. Each one of these has many variations, and each has its difficulties. Whatever interpretation one accepts, some details in the book require straining to fit. So whichever way you go, you're going to have some difficulties trying to line some of these things up. Now, I'm going to give you a brief explanation of each one of these. I've got some explanations in greater detail, but I didn't want to include them in these notes because it's going to take each one of these ways of interpreting it and really breaks it down even further. But what we have here is enough to give us a general idea of how these books are usually, these ways of thinking or interpretation. So first you have the idealist, or symbolic or spiritualizing interpretation. Separates the book entirely from any reference to historical events. So it has nothing to do with history whatsoever. Whether those of John's days or those at the time of the end or those in any time in between. So the idealist doesn't see this book as having any fitting into historical events, past, present, or future. It is seen as a pictorial representation in highly figurative language of great principles of divine government and of good overcoming evil, which are applicable to all times. So basically, it's just a really good story of, and if you depend on how you view what the revelation is about, overcoming the church, overcoming, it's just a really good story in very apocalyptic language that's declaring to us nothing that has happened will happen, or had happened will happen, or will, has, or how am I trying to say it? Has, will, or have. Have. I'm almost there. Had, has, or will. So I'm trying to put my mind in the time of John. So had happened, has happened in the time of John, will happen beyond the time of John. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's just symbolic, and there's no real, you don't need to look at times and say, oh, this fits here. And you don't need to do that. That's the idealist way of interpreting it. The preterist interpretation regards the book as referring entirely to its own day. Christianity's struggle with the Roman Empire. It assumes that everything was fulfilled during the period it was written, and that the story was told with imagery and symbolism to hide its meaning from the late first century pagans. This is typically the interpretation that you find in members of the church, that they tend to go this way. If not in whole, in part, right? They tend to see most of it as being something that was done back then. It was written for them at that point in time, and there was really, other than the coming of Christ, there wasn't anything to be fulfilled at that point in time. And we're going to look further into this and look at why one would be, what's the positives and negatives of going either way with these. The historical interpretation sees in Revelation a prediction of the whole period of church history from John's time to the end of the world, a sort of panorama, a series of pictures delineating the successive steps and outstanding features of the church's struggle to final victory. So it's just a playing out historically of what the church is going to go through. And maybe not so specific, but the idea of the struggles from the time the church came into existence in AD 33 until whenever the Lord returns, that's the way the historical interpretation would be done. And there are those who interpret it that way. And then there's the futurist interpretation. This centers the book largely around the time of the Lord's coming at the end of the world. This interpretation holds that most of the book, chapters 4 through 22, reveals events that are yet to be fulfilled. The futurist view is the view most widely held in American evangelical churches. It is where you get this preeminent idea of premillennialism. So this view, the futurist view, puts almost the entire book of Revelation as future events to come. And then I wrote down here, Haley follows this view. Now, the reason I put that out is I took, this is from Haley right here, these different points here. And others have the same points. It's common knowledge that these are the general ways that it's interpreted. So, but I put him in there, and I put Haley follows this view because he says, in his introductory material, he says, and we will interpret Revelation from this perspective. So Haley views it as everything being future. So I just want to include that in there. He's a proponent of it, and so, all right. All right, here's some other principles of interpretation. The Bible is its own best interpreter, right? Which means don't try to find a bunch of outside sources to interpret what the Bible can interpret itself. And too often, that's what people do. They look to outside things. When you begin to see a highly symbolic language, the danger that follows symbolic language, not because the language is dangerous, it's what people will do to it. And this is what we see today. Because the revelation is highly symbolic, then people just believe they can really just make those symbols mean whatever they want. Because who's going to argue with them? If I can find enough people to agree with me that this means this, and this means this, oh, that sounds good. And this other person says, well, I don't believe that's what the symbolism means. It's like, well, I do. And so then all of a sudden you have all these varying beliefs developing because of the symbolism. And so there's a danger in that. But what we have to do is allow the Bible to interpret itself where it will do that, and not start coming up with some concoctions of what we think these things may be without any support biblically for those things. Large context, then immediate context. So when you look at the Revelation, you've got the forest, but you also need to look at the little tree or the meadow, right? So you've got large context and then immediate context. Don't go beyond one or the other. Don't look at the immediate context and forget what the larger context is, and don't look at the larger context and forget what he's saying right here. You got to bring them together and make sure that you're keeping what's being said in context, because sometimes what happens is that the context of what you're studying in this one small, right, context is explained in the larger context. And if you don't allow yourself to see the larger context, then you're going to maybe interpret this to be something that it doesn't have anything to do with. Background, history, purpose, style. That's very important. When you're going back and you're looking at the history of the church at the time, what they were going through, what is the reason for the book, right? That's really one of the best ways to help you interpret the book is what's the purpose behind it? And how does this fit into the life of the Christian? Because it's written to Christians, so the purpose is applicable to Christians. Then what is the purpose? And finding that purpose can help you understand what's being said there. Style of writing, and that's why we say when you look at apocalyptic literature, then you're looking at literature that's very symbolic. So you have to keep that in mind. When you're reading the Revelation, you have to keep in mind that it's symbolic in what it's showing. Now, that doesn't mean that the symbols don't have something that they're representing as fact. But you have to understand that they are symbols of something. And once you understand that, then you don't take the symbol and make it literal, right? Oh, well, because some people will look through it and they'll read it and they'll see it as just being literal, whatever it says. You got a hard time translating and interpreting the Revelation in a literal sense. It would just be a fantasy novel if you do it that way. If you just interpret it in a literal sense, you're going to be reading things you're like, I don't even know what this is talking. Nothing in the history of man has ever unfolded the way this fantasy literature is unfolding before me as I interpret it in a literal way, right? You're going to look at this beast with 10 horns and it's coming up out of the ocean. What, Godzilla showed up all of a sudden? So you got to be cautious with that when you're looking at style. New Testament interprets Old Testament quotations. So you can use one for the other. If you're going back and you're looking, and vice versa, if you're going back and you're seeing an Old Testament passage or a New Testament passage, they can help to interpret. And you have to do that with this, considering that you have Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, right? These are being quoted in the New Testament, but they're Old Testament passages. And so rather than running back to the Old Testament and all of a sudden trying to interpret the Old Testament to mean something and then jumping forward to the Revelation and then look at the Revelation and saying, oh, well, we've interpreted Daniel to mean this, so over here in the Revelation, this is what it means. Well, how did you interpret that in Daniel to mean that? How did you get to that point in Daniel when you said, that's what this is, and now you're inserting that interpretation into this New Testament passage in the Revelation? So if you look at the Revelation and it's talking about this, then you should let the New Testament passage that's referring back to the Old Testament interpret that one back there. You see what I'm saying? So if I'm reading through Daniel and I read a passage that I can't understand because it's symbolic, and I see that same passage being quoted in the New Testament, and the New Testament is clarifying that, then that passage interprets the Old Testament passage. Rather than me going, I don't know what this Old Testament passage means, but I think I'll make something up. And then when I jump over to the Revelation, I go, oh, guess what? He said the same thing over the Revelation. And now that means the same thing as I interpreted it to mean in Daniel. Except for you had no source to interpret in Daniel other than your imagination. Allow these to interpret each other when you can and where they will. Remember prophetic nature, all right? Always remember that when you're coming to prophetic nature. Sometimes, And when you look at prophecy, there's two ways that we've always seen prophecy done. What are they? And whenever you hear prophecy, what's the first thing you think of? Future events. But is all prophecy future event? No. So some prophecy is. What's the other way to prophesy? Teaching. Thank you very much. So you have a foretelling that is a revealing of God's will. The New Testament scriptures are what? Prophecies. So when I'm reading 1 Corinthians, that's of some future event. No, it's a revelation of God's will to the people of the time. That is prophecy. Just go back and read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, chapter 12, chapter 13. He's talking about the gift of prophecy. What was prophecy used for? It was to reveal God's will. So yes, there is a prophecy. And when you go back and look at the Old Testament prophets, the main focus of the Old Testament prophets was what? It was not future events. The bulk of Old Testament prophecy was not talking about something to happen in the future. It was talking about something they needed to be doing right then and there. Now, did it have future prophecy? Yes, certainly it did. The prophecies of Christ are in there. But the bulk of it was not about future events. The bulk of it was the prophets telling God's people, this is what God wants you to do now. You need to be doing this now. Pat, did you have something? Okay. So, remember prophetic nature. Sometimes there's going to be future event, certainly, but sometimes it's just going to be a revelation of what God's will is. If you look at the revelation as being nothing but all future event, other than chapters 1 through 3, as the futurist view says, 4 and on through 22, then really there's no prophecy of a foretelling there, of really any application to the people of the first century. Because they would pick it up and they'd go, okay, well, chapters 1 through 3 are going to say something that is applicable to us, but the entire rest of this book is some future event down the road because it's all prophecy of future. Well, is it? Or is it, in fact, a mixture? Is there some, right? And you see that in the Old Testament. There'd be prophets who, for example, Daniel's a great example of that. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel's talking about Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, right? What's the future event he talks about in that? In Daniel chapter 2, remember the statue, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar? There's a future event in there. Travis.
It's predicting now the political climate for the next 400 years.
Up until when?
Up until about 100 years before Christ.
There you go. He talked, and then what else does he mention in there? What's the other political of sorts that he brings in? The stone that's hewn out of a mountain without hands. What is that? The kingdom of God. So in that vision, he talks about Nebuchadnezzar's current kingdom, the head, and then he goes down through the body. You've got the Medo-Persian Empire, you got the Greek Empire, you got the Roman Empire, and then in the days of that empire, that's the future. So those are all future because Nebuchadnezzar is still ruling, so that's a foretelling. But then he begins to prophesy of what's coming. So you have a mixture there. You have current and what is to come. So keep that in mind when you're looking at prophecy. Don't just assume it's one or the other. It may be a combination of both. Symbolism. This is one of the difficulties that you run into in the Revelation. And I have a book on this, and I remember Peggy always saying, yeah, but you still have to trust the people who wrote the book that what they're saying about those numbers is accurate, right? Because numbers are used quite a bit. Like the number 7 is a very common number. The Hebrew people use numbers in symbolic ways. 3, 1, 3, right? Now, I've got a whole book that just talks about what these numbers were. Now, we're not left to the writers of the book to accept that. Just like anything else historically, the writers of these books have gone back and have been able to, through study, archaeology, old archives, understood and passed down through generations through the Hebrew people, the Jews, how these numbers were used. So it's not as if all of a sudden we just forgot about them and 2,000 years later somebody said, hey, I think this is what those numbers mean. It's not. It's something that's been historically documented for the Jews And we know that. And so when you're looking at symbolism, numbers are one of those things. And for example, what's one of the common numbers you hear in the Revelation that is really misrepresented to this day?
1,000-year reign.
The 1,000-year reign. The 144,000, right? That those numbers, they mean something. And if you take a literal view of it, which there is a religion out there that does, there's only 144,000. I remember studying with these guys one time. I said, so let me ask you something. You believe there's only 144,000 that are actually going to be in the heavenly kingdom, in heaven itself, and the rest of you are going to live here on earth? They said, yeah. I'm like, so do you think now does this include Jews? Oh, yes. And I said, so do you think from the beginning of time until today that we haven't hit 144,000? Do you know that they say on an estimate 156,000 people die a day in this world? A day. 156,000 people die a day. So you're telling me for over 6,000 years, the 144,000 hasn't been reached? And then they looked at me. I'm like, which means you guys are not part of that. Well, no. Now, let me finish your study. So they go on to say, I was asked about communion. They said, well, we take communion once a year. I'm like, well, who takes communion? And they said, well, if you're one of the 144,000, you take communion. And I said, well, how do you know if you're one of the 144,000? And they said, well, if you take communion. And I thought, well, couldn't I just take communion and say I'm one? So that means that there's still some 144,000 after 6,000 years of human history, God's people from Adam and Eve all the way to this day and time, new people are coming into this. So you run into a problem when all of a sudden you make it a literal number and you're trying to make it fit. It's like, well, doesn't quite make sense that there's only, 144,000 and then probably nobody beyond, the second or third century would actually amount to being part of this whole heavenly thing. It's only going to be, the rest of us could just be here on this earth. So I'm just using that as an illustration that there's symbolism in the Bible, and be sure that you understand the symbolism before you begin to interpret something without understanding that symbolism.
And the ones that believe in that 144,000, they're the same people that believe that all you have to do is pray them into your heart or believe. And so that would include about a bazillion,
Well, I mean, yeah, it's like nobody, who's going to be left out of that? Yeah. So, and the reason I bring them up is because you see a problem with that kind of interpretation. And oftentimes they just don't stop and think about it. You're like, well, I'm kind of curious about this because it seems to me that nobody sitting here would be involved in that. Because we're at 6,000 years down the road. You don't think somewhere along the way, that 144,000 made it already? And if that's not the case, man, what kind of hope do we have? Travis?
Those 144,000 are not Gentiles either.
No, because it's from the tribes of Israel. Yeah. And then there's myriads. The myriads are the ones that are here on earth. The rest of, so it's like, well, I suppose just the Israelites. So the bulk of it's Israel, the 144. Total meaning rather than details. All right, so this is important. Total meaning rather than details. Again, if you get lost in all the little things, you're going to lose sight of the bigger picture, right? And you don't want to do that. You want to be able to say, this is what the total meaning of this is, in conjunction with trying to understand as much of the detail as you can. And again, you don't want to waste your time on trying to understand things that actually don't have any real connection to anything spiritual. It's just part of the story and doesn't matter. Not everything that God puts in there. It's like, if everything that God had written in his word mattered, can you know how ridiculous that is? What about the water that Jesus walked on when he called Peter out to himself? What kind of water was it? The clouds, how bad was the storm? The boat, how big was the boat? What was Peter wearing? Maybe that weighed him down. I'm not sure, but Peter was probably wearing some heavy clothes. And why does that matter? all that stuff. Well, because everything that God wrote down mattered. Like the larger picture. Let's keep in mind the total meaning. Do not make obscure passages key to the book. Very important. People find these obscure passages that are very difficult to understand, and somehow that becomes the key. You know why it's the key? Because it's hard to understand. And if it's hard to understand, it's got to be the key. No, it doesn't have to be the key. It could just be a difficult passage to understand. But if you waste your time on going, okay, this has got to, and then somehow I'm going to finally figure that out, and that interprets the entirety of whatever else I'm looking at. You know, you hear these ways that people interpret the Revelation where they read between the lines, so to speak, right? These hidden messages that are in that. I can show you one where, matter of fact, I have it in the notes here, where they're trying to pinpoint the date of the Revelation, and they use who is it? Nero, Caesar Nero, and I think it's Nero. And his name, if you take the Hebrew letters and you break them down to numbers, they amount to 666. And his name in Hebrew would have been these letters, and those letters add up to 666. You know how many times people take things like that? But what's funny about that is they said, the author says, but here's also some other names that end up doing the exact same thing. And so you're like, well, okay, here's some other names that end up exactly there as well. So is it one of those people too? So you got to be careful. Don't make obscure passages key to the book. What is one of the things that when it comes to interpretation, one of the practices is always allow the clear passage to do what? Interpret the one that's not. Thank you, Ken. So always allow the clear passage to interpret the difficult passage. If the difficult passage is, if the clear passage is talking about the same thing as the difficult one, if the clear passage lays out for you exactly what, rather than this, then you say, okay, this, I'm going to allow this to interpret this over here. So, a prolipsis. All right. We talked about this in interpretation, the prolipsis. 2:11 is explained in 2014. So, something you read here can be explained later on. And you need to allow it to do that. Don't read it here and exclude later on what may be said. Allow the two passages, if they are similar or talking about the same context, look for the prolipsis and see if this one here isn't being interpreted somewhere else in the book, because oftentimes you'll find that. All right. What time we got? I tell you what, we're going to be in this for a little while. Let me go. Hold on a second. All right. Let me see if I can get through authorship here. All right. The book clearly claims to have been written by John. John 1:1, or Revelation 1:1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must soon take place. And he sent and communicated it by his angel to his bondservant John. 1:4, John to the 7 churches that are in Asia. 1:9, I, John, your brother and fellow participant. He says, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. And then 22:8, I, John, your brother and fellow participant in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. So the writer identifies himself as John. Ancient writers abundantly testify that John the Apostle wrote the book of Revelation. Justin Martyr, 110 to 165, wrote, there was a certain man with us whose name was John, one of the apostles of Christ, who prophesied by a revelation. Irenaeus, 120 to 202, a student of Polycarp, and Polycarp was a student of who? John, who was a student of the Apostle John, okay. Quoted frequently from Revelation and affirmed it was written by John, the Lord's disciple. And if Irenaeus is a student of Polycarp, and Polycarp is a student of John, I think you got the best evidence right there. that Polycarp is telling Irenaeus, he's passing the information on, and he would know above anyone else, I would suppose. Clement of Alexandria, 153 to 217, spoke of the Apostle John who returned to Ephesus from Patmos, thus identifying the Apostle John with the book of Revelation. That's one of the ways that you date the book as well. By, remember, where is it said that John ended his life? And we talked about this going back and looking at 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, that he ended up in Ephesus. And historically, it's written that that's where he remained. So he left Patmos and went to Ephesus. So it was somewhere in this period that we can pinpoint. Tertullian referred in 145 to 220, referred to Revelation 21:2 and said the Apostle John beheld it. So he speaks of John the Apostle. And then Origen and Hippolytus, 185, 254 to 170, 236, both referred to the Revelation and said it was written by the Apostle John. So going back in the 1st and 2nd centuries, you have individuals who are testifying that the author of this book was the Apostle John. The book itself identifies the writer as John. And then one other thing is a comparison of doctrine and terminology in Revelation with that of John's gospel account. One of the ways that if you have books that are written and they have the name of the same author but in different books, one of the ways to identify if it is the exact same John, right? Because there's more than just John the Apostle was not the only John around, right? So how do you know? And one of the ways you do it is looking at style of writing. Although there are those who argue that the style of writing is different from what John wrote before. But if you look back at what are the writings of John? The Gospel, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, right? So you get the Gospel, and then the Revelation. Well, you're naturally going to find a variation in writing style in the Revelation. Why? Because it's apocalyptic, it's symbolic. So you're going to find some things in there, certainly a whole lot of things in there that maybe John never mentioned. But it's not those things that you're looking for, it's the things that are the same. So, and you've got your handouts, go back and study these. The Lamb of God, the Gospel of John 1:29, only John uses this. And then look at Revelation 5:6 and 28 times more. So you find this phrase being used. The Logos, John 1:1, and then 1 John 1:1, and then in Revelation 19:13. The pre-existent Christ, the Gospel of John 1 through 3, Revelation 1:17 and 18. Who was pierced, John 19:34, only recorded by John, and then we find that in Revelation 1:7, and that comes from Brother Chuck Horner. The universal testimony of the early Christian writers is that John left Jerusalem shortly before its destruction, came to Ephesus where he spent the remainder of his earthly life. So left Jerusalem, he had been on Patmos, and there's some time period in there, and we're going to take a look at the different dates that can be given here, and that'll be coming in, because that's one of the things too. When was it written? That's one of the big discussions. Was it written later? Was it written earlier? What was going on? Nero, Vespasian, Domitian, who was the ruler, and can we pinpoint? All right, we'll stop there. So next week we will pick up with place and date. You've got your handout, spend time. The Revelation is really a very good book to study, especially if you can get down to the heart of what it's about. If you don't get caught up in all the symbolism, try to understand. You want to understand the symbolism because it's powerful. The symbolism is powerful. But you don't want to miss the message by trying to and get lost in all the symbolism itself, if you know what I'm saying. So what are those symbols telling us? And what's the message that God is trying to get across? And we'll look at that when we get to the purpose of this apocalyptic literature, the Revelation.